Hello. This is a video about the genetic history of Native Americans. In other words, how Native Americans came to be as a population that is distinct from others. This video is a sketch on a series about archaeogenetics that I'm making. If you have reached this place, you probably reach through one of the vectors of dissemination that I'm planning on employing, such as the his or int boards on portion, or simply the video stayed here and you're watching it now. In any case, thanks for watching this. Hope that it's informative and likable. As I mentioned, this video is on the genetic history of Native Americans, and I'm choosing Native Americans as an starting population in order to dwell in concepts that will be repeated and will emerge intermittently throughout the series. I'm choosing them because of three main reasons. The first one is that Native Americans separate themselves in the archaeological and the fossil record from other human populations by over 20,000 years. Thus, they retain a plethora of ancestral placemorphic traits, which bring us to the second reason: Native Americans are genetically simple to describe. Not only are they simple, but the ancestral populations from which they come from are extremely prolific and extremely important to understand in order to have a cohesive, full understanding of all human populations, where they come from and how they came to be. And the third reason is because Native Americans as a study field are very polemic debate in such a way that several times the different sides of the argument have mischaracterized each other as fringe theorists or conspiranoicists. In any case, we will see that the reality of the case, or the truth of the matter, is that there is kind of a synthesis between both sides. For the purpose of delimiting the framework or setting the epistemological basis for this video, Native Americans, or what I refer as Native Americans, are the pre-Columbine populations of South Central North America reaching all the way to Greenland. We know that this population reached the Americas somewhere on the time frame of 20,000 years ago. The margins vary between the 24,000 to the 16,000 years ago. This divergence in the time frames is simply because of the limitations of the methodologies that we use to test time frames. Thus, it's the best we got. The main two theories for the peopling of the Americas are obviously the most well-known: the theory of the Bering Crossing, the Bering Strait, which was a land bridge that connected Siberia to North America to Alaska, and that existed all the way to the last ice age, where it melted at the end of it. We know that this migration would have happened with a population of no more than 200 individuals. It was a very genetically and numerically constrained population. And also we know that this migration would have happened not one, but up to 3 times. We know that there is certain genetical evidence, cultural and anthropological. There's a lot of evidence to demonstrate this fact. The other theory, a lot less scientifically accepted or consensus, and a lot more ridiculized or put on the category of fringe, is the Solutrean hypothesis. The Solutrean hypothesis suggests that there was a species of mythical navigational route from Europe through the Atlantic into North America and then the rest of the Americas. The Solutrean hypothesis obviously relates to the Solutreans of Europe, the Solutreans being the last period of the Gravettian Lithic culture. And there's also some evidence that has been misunderstood both in archaeological and genetical fields. Nonetheless, this is very important to mention because, as we will see, the Solutrean hypothesis doesn't get as many things wrong as we traditionally think. Alright, so let's begin with who are the real ancestors of Native Americans. In order to start this, first I want to underlay 2 basic building blocks of West Eurasians and East Eurasians. West Eurasians is what we traditionally understand as the populations of Europe and the Middle East. And East Eurasians is what we traditionally understand as the populations of East Asia, Southeast Asia, and Polynesia, Melanesia, Austronesia, and in general all Pacific Islanders and the populations of Siberia. In other words, what traditionally has been called Mongoloids and Caucasoids in historical anthropology and ethnography, although those terms are not very well regarded nowadays. There's a lot of truth to this distinction between Mongoloids and Caucasoids, or West Eurasians and East Eurasians, because what evidence shows us is that the two populations are separated by over 20,000 years of genetic isolation from one another. This happened in North Africa roughly 70,000 years ago, when a population pertaining of less than 50 people migrated out of Africa throughout Arabia and the Indian subcontinent, reaching all the way to Southeast Asia, where they remained in a very basal, undeveloped state, then spread throughout the rest of East Asia. We, to this day, have the living fossils of this original migration in all the Negrito populations that inhabit the Indian islands and also all the archipelagos of Southeast Asia, such as the Andamese or the Aeta people in the Philippines. These Negrito populations are the original state of this East Eurasian migration. When the East Eurasians left Africa 70,000 years ago with white DNA haplogroups C and D and mtDNA haplogroup N, they left a remaining population on Africa. The single population retained a lot less genetic diversity than what was before, and thus this population became a lot more morphologically and genetically constrained. This population also had already developed, by the time they left Africa 50,000 years ago, a phenotype. We'll talk about what is a phenotype later, but this population is what we understand as West Eurasians. This West Eurasian population migrated out of Africa not through Arabia and through India, but rather through Egypt into the Levant, then Anatolia, and then Europe and Siberia, all the way to Lake Baikal, which is a natural site in East Russia, very close to the triple border between Mongolia, China, and Russia. This West Eurasian population separated and divided into three main groups. One that consolidated in Europe, becoming the Eotic nations. In the Gravettian period, the Gravettian culture. Another one that consolidated in Europe and the Middle East later, and is mostly related with also West Eurasians, and the last population that consolidated in Russia, and that is descended from the Gravettians, and thus carries the Gravettian lithic culture and methods, such as what's known as the overshot flanking, which I'll talk about in a bit. This West Eurasian schism, as we will call it, led to the genetic archaeological populations known as Western hunter-gatherers in Europe, Anatolian hunter-gatherers in the Middle East, and incorporated an earlier migration out of Africa known as the basal Eurasians, and ancient North Eurasians in Siberia. Ancient North Eurasians is the population that we are going to pay attention to for this video. Ancient North Eurasians are genetically mostly descended from the Gravettians that inhabited Eastern Europe and that descend as well from this original West Eurasian migration, with the caveat that they incorporate ancestry from East Eurasians as well. And ancient Eurasians derive most of their ancestry from a very particular population that is related to the remains that are found on the Sangir site, that is considered by researchers to be one of the most well-conserved Gravettian burial ever. It's remarkable how well-conserved all human artifacts are there. A population genetically related to the remains from Sangir probably migrated east due to conflict, due to the very quick and probably very militaristic spread of West Eurasians. They reached modern-day Siberia, where they met this East Eurasian population. The congregation of the two produced ancient North Eurasians, a population that is overall, the estimates vary, but somewhere around the 75 to 85% West Eurasian and 15 to 25% East Eurasian. In a certain way, we will even talk about more of an ancient Eurasian clan, because Eastern hunter-gatherers, which is a population that is ascribed to be genetically descended from ancient Eurasians, has a lot more West Eurasian ancestry than the populations that we see, for example, in the Malta Buret cave, which is the most important yaciment or the most important archaeological site of ancient Eurasians, where we found the Malta Boy, which is to this day the methodological basis and the thesis of what ancient Eurasian is composed of. Like, we defined ancient Eurasian as a population that is genetically related to the remains from the Malta Boy. We are not so sure from where in this clan Native Americans descend, because Native Americans also have genetic information that is not exclusively ancient Eurasian, but West Eurasian. The main argument for this is the existence of mtDNA haplogroup X among Native Americans, which is a haplogroup that is found in Europe today and also Anatolia. And this haplogroup at this point in history was only found in Europe. We can suggest that Native Americans actually are, if not fully ancient Eurasian, mostly ancient Eurasian, with possibly some incorporations from Anatolian and Western hunter-gatherers. But generally, when we plot Native Americans with other modern human populations, we see that they are roughly overall 40% West Eurasian and 60% East Eurasian. Whatever that means in terms of different percentages is very, very debatable, is very within the realms of what is the margin of error for the methodologies that we are applying, and thus is not truly worth debating. So once we have defined ancient Eurasians, we can talk about East Eurasians. These Negrito populations that inhabit all South and Southeast Asia, they start to migrate to all the rest of Asia. We have one special archaeological site and one very specific individual, that is the Tianyuan man. The Tianyuan man are remains that are found in China of an individual that genetically is almost indistinguishable from modern-day East Asians, and is described or is hypothesized to have died somewhere around the 40,000 to 50,000 years ago. This Tianyuan man seems to have consolidated his population's numbers in a very elongated time frame. And nevertheless, this East Eurasian population reached eventually Siberia, where they met ancient North Eurasians. What happened here was that there was a very aggressive interaction between the two, which probably caused the murder or genocide of all the male individuals of East Eurasian ancestry, leaving only ancient North Eurasian males and East Eurasian females. We know this because the genetic composition of Native Americans, like the genetic information that we see on the Native Americans of the Andes, is exclusively genetically male haplogroup K, which is ancient North Eurasian in origin and very related to our haplogroup, that is the main haplogroup in Europe, and mtDNA haplogroups A, B, C, and D, which are exclusively East Eurasian in ancestry. It makes a lot of sense that this is the case, because we must keep in mind that the interactions between West Eurasians are not amicable in any way. West Eurasians in general, historically, seem to have very conflictive interactions between each other that usually end up in the killing of the men of one of the groups and the raping of the women of the other group. Thus, it's probable that there was already a culture of which ancient North Eurasians are both victims and executors of. And this was carried into their interaction with East Eurasians. This population eventually consolidated genetically into the first population that we theorize migrated into the Americas, that is known as the Ancestral Native Americans, also from the remains of a child that is found in Russia, in eastern Russia. This population is where we already have a consolidated single population of no less than 200 people that migrates into the Americas. What most researchers, or even the general consciousness of education and research and the population in general, understands for what Native Americans are. A population that entered the Americas through Bering and reached throughout millennia all the way to South America, where they eventually became groups that we know as the Incas or the Chibchas, the Selknam, the Patagonian natives, the Chachapoyas, so many Native American populations of South America and Central America and North America that are, and most of them derive the majority of their ancestry from this original migration. Original migration that, as have described already, is roughly 40% West Eurasian and 60% East Eurasian, with varying estimates, and also that for the most part has paternal haplogroup Q and R and maternal haplogroups A, B, C, and D, and the outlier haplogroup X that I have already mentioned that is found not in all but in some populations. And we can hypothesize that it simply became geographically constrained due to simply the way in which migrations work, and it's 100% sure that the ancestral group of all Native Americans did have this haplogroup as part of the genetic repertoire. This original population remained untouched and unchanged, genetically persistent, perennial for 10,000 years, or possibly even more. And it's a population that we relate to so many remains and so many peoples. We related to the Kennewick man, we related to the Shelter Horn Cave man. I don't remember the name of this. Maya, I think it's the name. And we're related to the Corral and the Norte Chico sites in Peru. In general, it's very prolific, and it's the main representative of what Native Americans are and what we understand them to be. However, it's not all of this what Native Americans are. We know that Native Americans have reached the Americas in at least two, possibly 3 or 4 migrations from Siberia, all of them through the Bering Strait. The second migration into the Americas that is hypothesized comes from the fact there are at least 2 different lithic cultures in the Americas before the development of agriculture and metallurgy and all of those developments that happened with the Aztecs and the Mayas and the Incas. During most of this period, Native Americans engaged in what is known as the Clovis stone culture or Clovis-related stone technology. The Clovis stone culture is manufactured through the overshot flanking method, which is a method in which the stone is hit at an angle in such a way that you can chip the ends of it in order to produce weapons and utensils. Because of this reason, even though Clovis refers only to the lithic culture that is found in North America, most other lithic cultures throughout the Americas, including South America, are related to the Clovis culture. However, there is another completely different technology on North America that is not done through overshoot flanking. Thus, it begins to demand questioning how this different culture emerged, because it's something that is very important to pay attention to. Like in Evolutivo, you pay a lot of attention to the details, not to the grand morphologies, because they can lie to you. They cannot be as intuitive in their presentation as they are. There's something that is called convergence, and it's very important to pay attention to those details, because yes, while it could be easy for a population to contrive and to produce and to invent a completely different lithic technology, what will be the reason to change something that works if it's not better but rather adjacent or parallel? It makes no sense, because it first of all is a renouncement to culture that is something that is very human and very inherent to the tribe, and thus we will probably not engage in changing it unless it's beneficial. And second of all, it's something that takes effort, and effort is also something that is evaded by human nature. This different lithic culture is not only that, but there's also different burial culture, and there's also genetic evidence and linguistic evidence. During the 60s, there was this American researcher that talked about Native American language families. And he wrote that there was at least 3 macro families, one that corresponds to all the languages of South America, and one that corresponds to the Na-Dene languages and another that is related to the Eskimos and other populations of the Arctic Circle in Canada. Although it was not accepted by all the linguistic community, it's very propitious, very proper, because it seems to be perfectly matched with the migratory model of peopling of the Americas. The South American, Central American language macrofamily is correspondent to this original first migration to the Americas, while the Nadene languages and the distinct lithic and burial cultures of North America are also corresponded to the introduction of white DNA haplogroup C into the Americas, which is a haplogroup that was not found before. It's East Eurasian in origins. Certainly, it could have been possible that the ancient Eurasians allowed some East Asians to survive and to come with them into the Americas through the Bering Strait, but it does not explain the percentages and why in South America this C haplogroup disappears. It's almost as a decline. The more further to the north that you are in the Americas, the more prolific or the more abundant the existence of this haplogroup C is. And as you go south, it starts to disappear. By the time you reach Peru or you reach Chile, it's non-existent. And since all the Americas were populated by the same people, why would it be constrained in such a way? The main argument for this is the fact that the Chibcha languages that are found in Colombia do not belong to the South American language family, but rather are related to the languages of Central America, which seem to have certain morphological features that are shared with the Nadene languages. And not only this, but this Chibcha population that is found in Colombia has a lot of haplogroup C, which is nowhere else to be found in Colombia. So if the language is being introduced and also the haplogroup, it means that thus there's a very high possibility that this second migration of East Eurasian population that entered the Americas bringing haplogroup C with them happened. And it will have happened somewhere around the time frame of 5,000 years ago. This population obviously changed the genetic composition of North America because while the original Native Americans, the intermixing between ancient Eurasians and East Eurasians was already there, they were integrated or they merged with this second migration, which caused the reduction of the percentage of ancient Eurasian blood. Which is quite true. When we analyze the genetic ancestry of a Native American from Peru or a Native American from Chile or from Argentina, we see that they are overwhelmingly ancient Eurasian and East Eurasian in the percentage that is somewhere around the 40 to 60 or 50 to 50. Meanwhile, when we analyze Native Americans from North America, this percentage of ancient Eurasian drops. When you reach Canada, when you reach Greenland, you see that the populations there, the Athabascans, the Eskimos, the Tulians, all of those populations indeed are genetically the lowest percentage of ancient North Eurasian of all Native Americans, which led us to the last and final migration to the Americas, that is the one that was enforced by a population mostly related to modern-day populations of Siberia, such as the Yakuts that came from Central Asia or probably from the Arctic Circle. We are not so sure about it. There's a lot of debate about linguistics, but eventually does cross the Bering Strait one final time, or even probably just navigates vessels into the Americas and consolidates itself in the north. These populations show the least percentage of ancient North Eurasian of all Native Americans, which ends up consolidating a cline with Native Americans on the northernmost tip being, if not almost overwhelmingly East Eurasian, all the way to the natives of Chile, Peru, and Argentina, where Native Americans are indeed the most ancient North Eurasian and the most closely related to the modern-day populations of Central Asia, or people, for example, a Hapa, which will be the intermixing between a European and a person from East Asia, such as a Chinese or Korean person. Native Americans are the intermixing between an ancient population that is related to modern-day peoples of Europe, especially Eastern and Northeastern Europe, and a population that is related to the modern-day populations of East and Southeast Asia. Ancient North Eurasians, East Eurasians, gathered through aggressive interaction, but nonetheless makes producing the modern day populations of the Americas.